Chapter 16 is about globalization. And when we talk about globalization, we basically mean the increasingly interconnected pieces of the economy. And in chapter 16, we'll talk about sort of three ways that economies can be connected. One is through trade in goods and services. Two is through the movement of people, so migration. And three is the movement of capital, right? Capital and finance, and how that can move from one country to another. And one of the questions then that is often asked, especially in this country, is whether or not globalization has been good. There's been a lot of criticism about the increased trade with China. There's been a lot of criticism about the increased migration that we've experienced over the last 20 years, although recently it has slowed down quite a bit. And then there's the question of whether it's good for economic growth, both globally and within a country like the United States. So we're going to try to answer those questions as we move through this chapter. The way we're going to do that is to use the models that we have, both the sort of micro models and the larger macro models. So we'll look at trade, we'll look at what happens when trade costs go down, we'll look at winners and losers from trade, we'll look at migration, what happens to the labor market when we get an increased flow of migrants into a country like the United States. And then what about the flow of capital between countries like the United States and a country like China or Vietnam? Um, so one sort of measure of how global a firm is the number of employees that they have around the world. So Ford is one example of a firm that has decided to produce cars around the world. So you can see that while the United States still has the most employees, there's quite a number of employees in China and Brazil. And then it starts to decrease, but there are employees all over the world: Germany, Belgium, India, Slovakia. And that makes sense for a uh, company like Ford that makes cars and trucks, because those are one of the most expensive things to transport. So if you want to be in the Chinese car market, it makes a certain amount of sense to produce those cars in China rather than producing them in the United States and shipping them over. That said, there are companies, of course, that produce cars and trucks in one part of the world and transport them to another part of the world. But there are also a lot of companies that um, produced cars in multiple countries. This is different than, say, a company like Apple that produces their phones in one place, taking parts from all over the world, assembles them, and then sells them all over the world, right? A phone is a lot easier to transport than a car. So when we talk about the integration of goods markets, we tend to look at sort of two different measures. One is the share of GDP that is getting traded, right? And we'll see that that has increased, especially over the last 50 to 60 years. And then we look at the difference between prices in countries, right? So if there are tariffs or taxes on trade, then prices will be different in different countries. If there are high costs to trade, so it's really expensive to move goods from one country to another, then there will be different prices. But as tariffs decrease, as transportation costs decrease, then we would expect to see prices that are more similar. And so we'll look at that as well. So here's just a look at the percentage of GDP that gets exported on a global basis. And so you can see we go back to 1820, where most GDP was not traded. It was around 2% of GDP, maybe 1% of GDP. But it had a fairly steady rise all the way until about 1930. So more and more goods were being traded as the Industrial Revolution expanded to more and more countries. And in fact, a lot of the conflicts that happened in the 19th and early part of the 20th century were about opening up new markets for the industrialized powers. In 1930, of course, the Great Depression began, and trade really fell off. So a lot of countries introduced tariffs, and of course, countries were having a recession, a very deep recession, and so they were buying fewer exports. Then, of course, we had World War II, which decreased trade further until about 1950. And then since 1950, we had a pretty steady increase until about 1990. And then at 1990, we saw a huge increase as countries like China and India started to grow. In 2000, China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, and that's when trade between China and the United States really started to take off. And we can see that, um, China became the production location for Apple in 2002 and has really become, the main manufacturing center of the world. All right, so let's think about trade and why the law of one price might not hold. So if we think about, we'll call the letter T the cost of trading. And so sometimes we and we might think of this as, shipping costs or whatever it is that costs money to take a good from one country and sell it in another country. So here we have just a regular supply and demand graph with quantity on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis. And we have the supply curve in whatever the producing country is, the exporting country. So now in perfect competition, remember that supply curve is going to be equal to the marginal cost of production. And here's the demand curve in the consuming country, the importing country. And so if there were no cost of trade at all, we can see that the equilibrium price would be here and the equilibrium quantity would be here. But if there is a price to trade, then there's going to be a price gap. So for instance here, if the price sells at $7.25 in the importing country, but it only costs $2.75 to make in the exporting country, then the price gap would be $4.50. As that uh, price gap shrinks and as the cost of trading decreases from T to say T prime, then we will see an increase in the amount that gets exported and imported, and will be closer to that law of one price. So here, T prime is 6 minus 4 or $2, and the quantity sold now is up to 6,000. And there have been a number of improvements in trade technology. So you can think of obviously shipping, containerization, um, airplanes. All of that has increased the ability to ship goods worldwide and decrease the cost. So here's an example of a cost difference between two markets. And so the United States has often exported quite a lot of its wheat to the UK, to Great Britain. And the red line here on the left axis shows the price gap. So you can see back in the mid 19th century, the price gap was 100 to 150%, although there were a lot of ups and downs. And that decreased fairly steadily until the late 19th and early part of the 20th century, where it almost disappeared, and there was a huge increase in British imports of wheat. That sort of bounced around. It was never got back up to that sort of 100% level, although there have been times where it was significantly more expensive in the UK than in the American market. But it just goes to show that as that price gap fell, imports increased. And so that was an increase in globalization. And as we'll see, the late 19th and early parts of the 20th century were really the first wave of an increase in globalization that fell off then during the Great Depression and World War II. You can see that happened in a number of goods, not just wheat. This shows the price discrepancy between the United States and UK at three different times: 1870 in red, 1895 in blue, and 1913 in green. You can see that the price discrepancy shrank for wheat, shrank for meats and animal fats, shrank for cotton textiles, shrank for iron bars, shrank for cotton, basically disappeared for copper. Uh, the only place where it increased was sugar. And that gives us one hint of some policies that might be involved. First of all, the UK still had quite a number of possessions in the British West Indies, which produce a lot of sugar, and so they had access to perhaps cheaper sugar than the United States did. Sugar is one industry in the United States that now is protected by a tariff, and so U.S. prices for sugar are higher than for most other countries.